The fog was so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Private Thomas Bracy of the 2nd Battalion, Royal Munster Fusiliers, crouched in his trench on the morning of March 21st, 1918, somewhere near the village of Ransa on the Somme. The mist had rolled in before dawn, a thick, wet blanket that turned the world into a gray nothing. He couldn't see the barbed wire 20 meters ahead. Couldn't see his mates in the next traverse. Couldn't see anything. But he could hear. And what he heard made his blood run cold. At exactly 4:40 a.m., the world exploded. The bombardment was like nothing any soldier on the Western Front had ever experienced. Over 6,600 German artillery pieces and 3,500 mortars opened fire simultaneously along a 46-mile stretch of the British front. In 5 hours, they would fire more than 3.5 million shells. Not over days or weeks, like the preparatory bombardments of the Somme or Passchendaele. In 5 hours. The biggest artillery barrage in human history up to that point. Thomas Bracy never wrote about what happened next. He died that morning, along with 7,512 other British soldiers. Another 10,629 were wounded. And 21,000 more were captured, simply vanished into the fog as German troops overran their positions before they even knew they were under attack. March 21st, 1918, would become the second worst day in British military history, surpassed only by the first day of the Somme. And it was just the beginning. This is the story of the the Kaiser's battle. The story of Germany's last desperate gamble to win World War I before American troops could tip the balance. The story of the Sturmtruppen, the elite German Stormtroopers who pioneered modern infantry tactics. The story of the largest territorial gains by either side since 1914. And the story of why, despite all their victories, the Germans still lost the war. To understand what happened on March 21st, 1918, we need to go back. Back to November 1917, when 3 men sat in a room and decided to stake everything on one final throw of the dice. General Erich Ludendorff was the first quartermaster general of the German army, effectively the supreme military commander, though nominally he served under Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg. By November 1917, Ludendorff knew Germany was running out of time. The numbers were brutal and inescapable. On the Western Front, the German army faced the combined might of Britain, France, and their empires. To the east, Russia was collapsing. The Bolshevik Revolution had taken Russia out of the war, and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk would officially end hostilities in March 1918. This freed up nearly 50 German divisions to transfer west. But there was a darker number looming. America. The United States had declared war on Germany in April 1917. By November, American troops were arriving in France at an accelerating rate. Not thousands. Hundreds of thousands. Eventually millions. Fresh troops. Well-fed. Well-supplied. Unblooded but eager. If Germany didn't win before the Americans arrived in force, Germany would lose. Ludendorff was many things: brilliant, ruthless, possibly insane, but he was not stupid. He knew this was Germany's last chance. Strike now, in spring 1918, before the Americans could fully deploy. Strike hard. Break the Allied lines. Win the war. Or lose everything. On November 11th, 1917, at the German High Command headquarters at Kreuznach, Ludendorff laid out his plan. It would be called Operation Michael, after Germany's patron saint. The target, the British Army. Why the British and not the French? Ludendorff had several reasons. First, the French army had been bled white at Verdun and during the Nivelle offensive. They had mutinied in 1917. They were exhausted, demoralized, defensive. They wouldn't break, but they wouldn't attack either. The British were different. The British had launched massive offensives at Arras, Messines, and Passchendaele in 1917. They had suffered appalling casualties, over 300,000 men at Passchendaele alone, but they kept attacking. Their commander, Field Marshal Douglas Haig, was aggressive to the point of obsession. The British army was exhausted, depleted, overstretched. And critically, it was separated from the French by a thinly held junction point near Street Quinton. Ludendorff's plan was simple in concept, complex in execution. Strike at the British Fifth Army, the weakest point in the British line. Break through. Drive northwest toward the English Channel ports Calais, Boulogne, Dunkirk. Cut the British off from their supply lines. Destroy the British Expeditionary Force. Force Britain out of the war. Then turn south and deal with the French. It was ambitious. Probably impossible. But it was the only chance Germany had. To execute this plan, Ludendorff needed more than just artillery and numbers. He needed something new. Something that could break through the defensive systems that had stalemated the Western Front since 1914. He needed the Sturmtruppen. The German Stormtroopers were born out of desperation and innovation. By 1915, it was clear that the old tactics massed infantry advancing in lines against machine guns and barbed wire were suicidal. The casualty rates at Verdun and the Somme proved that. Something had to change. The answer came from an artillery officer who had been retired for medical reasons and a general who thought differently than his peers. Lieutenant Colonel George Bruchmüller was 51 years old in 1915, when he was recalled from retirement. He had been a foot artillery officer before the war, the branch that handled the heavy guns and siege mortars. He had taught at artillery schools, commanded batteries, and been forced to retire in 1913 due to health problems, specifically diabetes. When the war began, Germany needed every experienced officer it could find. Bruchmüller was sent to the Eastern Front, given command of the artillery for the 86th Infantry Division, and told to support the infantry however he could. And Bruchmüller started thinking. The standard artillery tactics in 1915 were simple and brutal. Bombard the enemy positions for days, sometimes weeks. Fire millions of shells at the enemy trenches, barbed wire, and strongpoints. Destroy everything. Then send in the infantry to occupy the ruins. It didn't work. The enemy always had warning. They pulled their troops back during the bombardment, then moved them forward again when it stopped. The long bombardments destroyed the ground, turning it into a cratered moonscape that made advancing impossible. And the defensive positions were so deep, miles of trenches, bunkers, dugouts, reserve lines, that no amount of shelling could destroy them all. Bruchmüller proposed something radical: short, intense bombardments focused on specific targets. Instead of trying to destroy everything, Bruchmüller focused on disruption and neutralization. His targets were carefully selected: enemy command posts, telephone exchanges, artillery observation posts, artillery batteries themselves, and finally, the frontline infantry positions. The bombardment would be brief hours, not days, to preserve surprise. It would use a carefully orchestrated mixture of high explosive and gas shells. And it would be followed immediately by an infantry assault before the enemy could recover. Bruchmüller called his system the Führerwalls, literally, rolling fire, or fire waltz. The English would call it a creeping barrage. It worked in 3 phases. Phase 1, 10 minutes of gas shells targeting enemy command and control. Force the enemy to wear gas masks, which reduced their effectiveness. Hit headquarters, communication centers, radio stations, telephone exchanges. Isolate the frontline troops from their commanders. Phase 2, 4 hours of mixed gas and high explosive targeting enemy artillery. Destroy or neutralize the enemy guns so they can't fire counter-battery missions during the infantry advance. Bruchmüller developed a technique called Bunchian dash, colorful shooting, named after the color markings on German gas shells. Blue Cross shells contained diphenylchloroarsine, a powerful irritant that forced soldiers to remove their gas masks. Green Cross shells contained phosgene, a lethal lung agent. Yellow Cross shells contained mustard gas, which caused terrible burns. By mixing these gases with high explosive, Bruchmüller created a lethal cocktail that could kill or incapacitate enemy artillery crews. Phase 3, a creeping barrage moving at 100 meters every 4 minutes, staying just ahead of the advancing infantry. The infantry would follow as close as possible, sometimes within 50 meters of their own shells, advancing under the protection of the barrage. The system was brilliant, but it required something that the German army didn't have in 1915: centralized artillery control and precise pre-planned fire missions. Bruchmüller worked with another officer, Captain Fritz Polkowski, to develop a system of calibrating each individual gun. Every artillery piece is slightly different barrel wear, manufacturing variations, age and fires slightly differently. Standard artillery practice was to register the guns by firing ranging shots to see where they landed, then adjusting. Bruchmüller and Polkowski developed a way to calibrate guns in the rear areas, determining their exact ballistic characteristics, then using mathematics to calculate where they would hit without test firing. This meant the Germans could achieve surprise. The first shell of the bombardment would be on target, with no warning shots to alert the enemy. Bruchmüller first tested his system in April 1916 at the Battle of Lake Narek on the Eastern Front. It worked. The Russian positions were devastated. The German infantry advanced rapidly with minimal casualties. He refined it further at the Battle of Riga in September 1917, where General Oskar von Hütter's 8th Army captured the city using Bruchmüller's artillery preparation combined with new infantry tactics. The Riga operation was so successful that Bruchmüller earned the nickname Durchbruchmüller, Breakthrough Müller. But artillery alone wasn't enough. The infantry had to change too. The old German infantry tactics were straightforward: advance in lines, maintain unit cohesion, capture and hold objectives. These tactics had worked in 1870 against France, and in 1914 during the race to the sea. But by 1915, they were getting men killed in droves. The problem was that traditional infantry advances got stuck on strongpoints. A single machine gun nest could stop an entire battalion. Men would assault the position, die by the dozen, and the advance would stall while they waited for artillery or reinforcements. A German captain named Willy Rohr thought there had to be a better way. Rohr was an engineer officer who had been wounded and transferred to staff duties. In 1915, he was given permission to form an experimental unit to test new assault tactics. The unit was called Sturmabteilung Assault Detachment. The men were called Stormtroopers. Rohr's concept was simple but revolutionary: small groups of elite troops, heavily armed, moving independently, bypassing strongpoints rather than assaulting them head-on. The traditional infantry squad in 1915 was built around the rifle. 10 to 12 men, each with a bolt-action rifle, advancing together as a unit. If they encountered a machine gun, they would go to ground and wait for artillery or try to flank it, which usually meant more men dying while the machine gun kept firing. Rohr's stormtroopers were different. A stormtrooper squad had a squad leader with a Luger P-08 pistol and a dozen hand grenades, several men with modified Gur 98 carbines shorter than standard rifles, easier to handle in close combat, 1 or 2 men with machine pistols, submachine guns like the MP-18, which fired 9mm pistol rounds at 500 rounds per minute, 1 or 2 men with Madsen or Lewis light machine guns, men carrying sandbags full of hand grenades, often 20 or 30 grenades each, supporting elements with flamethrowers, mortars, and sometimes even small field guns that could be manhandled into no man's land. The tactics were just as revolutionary as the weapons. Stormtroopers were trained to move in small groups, using terrain and cover. When they encountered resistance, they didn't stop to fight. They bypassed it. Imagine a stormtrooper squad advancing through a trench system. They come to a fortified position, a bunker with a machine gun. The old tactics said, assault it, blow it up, clear it, then continue. The new tactics said, leave it. Throw smoke grenades to obscure the machine gun's field of fire. Have one squad suppress the position with machine gun fire. Send 2 other squads around the flanks. Push deeper into the enemy trench system. Cut communications. Spread chaos. Let the follow-on troops deal with the strongpoint. It was infiltration warfare. The stormtroopers were like water. They flowed around obstacles, always seeking the path of least resistance, always moving forward, always going deeper into the enemy position. The tactic had another name, Hütter tactics, named after General Oskar von Hütter, who perfected them at Riga. The principle was simple: identify the weakest points in the enemy line, concentrate force there, break through, and exploit the breakthrough before the enemy can react. By 1917, these tactics had been proven at Caporetto in Italy, where German and Austro-Hungarian forces using storm troop tactics had smashed through the Italian lines and advanced 150 kilometers in 2 weeks. They had been proven at Riga. They had been proven in small-scale actions across the Western Front. Now, in spring 1918, Ludendorff would test them on the largest scale yet attempted. But there was a dark side to the stormtrooper system, a fatal flaw that would ultimately doom the entire spring offensive. To create stormtrooper units, the German army had to cherry-pick the best soldiers from regular infantry divisions. The strongest, the smartest, the bravest, the most aggressive. These men were pulled out of their units, given extra training, extra rations, better equipment, and formed into elite assault battalions. This created 2 problems. First, it stripped the regular infantry divisions of their best men, leaving them with older soldiers, recovered wounded, and poorly trained replacements. Second, it meant that when the stormtroopers attacked and suffered casualties as they inevitably would, Germany was losing its very best soldiers. The men who could never be replaced. It was a tactical strength but a strategic weakness. And in a war of attrition, strategy matters more than tactics. But in November 1917, as Ludendorff planned Operation Michael, these concerns seemed distant. He had the tactics. He had the artillery system. He had transferred 50 divisions from the Eastern Front. He had to target the weak junction between the British and French armies. He had a plan. Now he needed to execute it without the Allies discovering what he was planning. The preparations for Operation Michael were staggering in scale. By March 1918, the Germans had concentrated 76 divisions over 1 million men in the attack sector. They had assembled 6,473 artillery pieces and 3,532 mortars. They had stockpiled ammunition on a scale never before seen. Over 1.1 million shells would be fired in the first 5 hours alone, with millions more in reserve. And they had to hide all of it from British reconnaissance. Ludendorff's staff implemented extraordinary security measures. All troop movements happened at night. Units were marched to assembly areas under cover of darkness, then camouflaged during the day. Artillery was moved into position at night, then covered with camouflage nets and foliage. Strict radio silence was enforced. All communications went by courier or telephone line. Deserters and captured prisoners were interrogated to ensure they knew nothing specific about timing or objectives. The British knew something was coming. Their intelligence services detected the buildup. Air reconnaissance photographed the assembly areas. Deserters and prisoners confirmed that a major offensive was planned. But the British didn't know exactly when or where the main blow would fall. Field Marshal Haig believed the attack would come farther north, toward the Channel ports. That's where he concentrated his best divisions. The Fifth Army, holding the southern sector where the attack would actually fall, was given 12 divisions to hold a 42-mile front. The Third Army to the north had 14 divisions holding a 28-mile front. The Fifth Army was commanded by General Hubert Goff, a cavalry officer known for his aggressive spirit but also for his tendency to take casualties. Goff was 47 years old in 1918, with a reputation for pushing his men hard. His army held the southern end of the British line, from just north of St. Quentin down to where the British and French lines met at Bar Isis. The Fifth Army had 2 critical weaknesses. First, it had only recently taken over this sector from the French in January 1918. The defensive positions were incomplete. The British defensive system in 1918 was supposed to have 3 zones: a lightly held forward zone to disrupt the initial attack, a heavily fortified battle zone where the main defense would be conducted, and a rear zone with reserves to counterattack. But in the Fifth Army sector, only the forward zone was complete. The battle zone consisted of scattered battalion strongpoints that weren't mutually supporting. The rear zone barely existed, just outline markings on maps. Second, Gough's divisions were under strength and exhausted. British divisions had been reduced from 12 battalions to 9 in early 1918 because Prime Minister Lloyd George was holding reinforcements in England, refusing to send them to Hague. The divisions that had fought at Passchendaele had been pulled back to the quiet 5th Army sector to rest and refit. They were tired. Their ranks were filled with new replacements who had never seen combat. The stage was set. The Germans had their elite stormtroopers, their revolutionary artillery tactics, and overwhelming numerical superiority at the point of attack. The British had incomplete defenses, exhausted troops, and were expecting the attack in the wrong place. On the night of March 20th to 21st, 1918, German stormtroopers moved into their final assault positions. They carried their weapons, their grenades, and emergency rations. Many wrote letters home. Some prayed. Most just waited in the cold darkness, knowing that when dawn came, they would be going over the top into the greatest battle of the war. At midnight, German artillery crews began their final preparations. Shells were stacked beside the guns' high explosive, shrapnel, gas. Coordinates were checked and rechecked. Officers synchronized watches. The gun crews knew the schedule by heart. They had rehearsed it dozens of times. At 4:40 a.m. precisely, they would fire. And they wouldn't stop for 5 hours. In the British trenches, soldiers stood watch, shivering in the cold. March in northern France is miserable, cold, wet, muddy. The men on watch duty stared out into no man's land, seeing nothing. The fog was getting thicker. Some veterans noticed that it seemed unusually quiet. The German artillery hadn't been firing harassing shots like they usually did. It was eerie. Wrong. At 4:40 a.m. on March 21st, 1918, the world changed forever. The bombardment began exactly on schedule. Every German gun and mortar opened fire simultaneously across a 46-mile front from the Sensee River in the north to the Oise River in the south. The sound was indescribable. Imagine standing next to a thunderstorm, then multiply that by 1,000. The earth shook. Men miles behind the lines were thrown from their beds. Windows shattered in villages 20 miles away. The first shells were gas blue cross, green cross, yellow cross. They burst in the British rear areas, over headquarters, artillery positions, communication centers. British soldiers scrambled for their gas masks. Officers tried to organize their units. Telephone lines went dead as shells cut the wires. Then came the high explosive. Shells rained down on the British forward zone, the outpost line of trenches and strongpoints where the first defense was supposed to be made. 150mm howitzer shells. 210mm shells. Even 380mm super heavy shells from railway guns, each weighing over 750 kilograms. Private William Shaw of the 8th Division was in a dugout near Fayette when the bombardment started. He wrote later, "The noise was beyond anything I had ever heard. It was like the world was ending. The dugout shook so badly I thought it would collapse. Dust and dirt rained down from the ceiling. We couldn't hear ourselves shout. Men were praying. Some were crying. We just huddled there in the dark, waiting to die." The British forward zone positions were systematically destroyed. Trenches collapsed. Dugouts caved in. Strongpoints were blown apart. Men who survived the shells were left dazed, bleeding from their ears, unable to hear or think. Behind the forward zone, the British artillery tried to respond. But Bruchmüller's counter-battery fire was devastatingly effective. He had identified every British artillery position through months of reconnaissance and spotting. Now his guns targeted them with a mixture of high explosive and gas. British gunners died at their pieces, poisoned by phosgene or blown apart by shells. Entire batteries were silenced within the first hour. And all of this was happening in fog so thick that visibility was down to 50 meters. British observation posts couldn't see anything. Artillery spotters couldn't direct fire. Battalion commanders couldn't see what was happening to their units. The fog was a gift from God to the German stormtroopers and a curse to the British defenders. At 9:40 a.m., exactly 5 hours after the bombardment began, the German guns shifted to a creeping barrage. And the stormtroopers advanced. They came out of the fog like ghosts. Small groups, moving quickly, weapons ready. The defenders, those who survived the bombardment, barely saw them before they were on top of them. The German assault was spearheaded by 3 armies. From north to south, General Otto von Billow's 17th Army attacking the southern flank of the British 3rd Army, General George von der Marwitz's 2nd Army in the center, and General Oscar von Hütter's 18th Army attacking the northern flank of the British 5th Army. Hütter's 18th Army was the key. It had the most stormtrooper units. It was commanded by the general who had perfected infiltration tactics at Riga. And it had Colonel George Bruchmüller commanding the artillery. If any army was going to break through, it would be Hütter's. The stormtroopers advanced in small groups called Sturmtruppen, literally thrust troops. A typical group would have 8 to 12 men. They moved through the fog, using compass bearings and landmarks they had memorized from maps and aerial photographs. When they encountered British positions, they followed their training, suppress with grenades and machine gun fire, bypass if possible, advance if the way was clear. The British forward zone positions were overrun within hours. Many garrisons never saw their attackers. They were simply surrounded in the fog, cut off, and forced to surrender when they ran out of ammunition. Entire battalions vanished. Battalion commanders lost contact with their companies. Company commanders lost contact with their platoons. The British defensive system, which relied on communication and coordination, collapsed into chaos. By mid-morning, German stormtroopers had penetrated the British forward zone and were pushing into the battle zone, the main defensive line where the real resistance was supposed to begin. But the battle zone in the 5th Army sector wasn't complete. It consisted of battalion strongpoints, fortified areas each held by 800 to 1,000 men, but these strongpoints weren't mutually supporting. There were gaps between them. Gaps that the stormtroopers could infiltrate through. And infiltrate they did. Following their doctrine, the stormtroopers bypassed the strongpoints, pushing deep into the British rear areas. They cut telephone lines. They ambushed supply columns. They overran artillery positions. They spread chaos and confusion throughout the British rear. The British strongpoints found themselves surrounded, cut off, under attack from all directions. Some held out for hours or even days. Others were overwhelmed quickly. The 36th Ulster Division, holding positions around Street Quinton, was particularly hard hit. The division's 9th Irish Fusiliers recorded that 3 battalions in the forward zone were completely lost, over 2,000 men killed or captured. 3 battalions in the battle zone were reduced to 250 men each. By the end of the day, the 36th Division had lost over 6,000 men, more than half its strength. By nightfall on March 21st, the situation was catastrophic for the British. The forward zone had been completely overrun. Large sections of the battle zone had been penetrated or surrounded. British casualties for the day totaled 38,500 men, 7,512 dead, 10,629 wounded, and over 21,000 captured. Only the first day of the Somme in 1916 had been worse. The Germans had suffered approximately 40,000 casualties, roughly equal to the British. But the Germans had achieved a breakthrough. They had advanced up to 14 kilometers in some sectors, the deepest advance by either side since 1914. They had captured 500 British artillery pieces. They had taken 21,000 prisoners. And they showed no signs of stopping. General Gough's 5th Army was in full retreat. Units were disorganized, communications were shattered, and there were no reserves to plug the gaps. To the north, Byng's 3rd Army was holding better. The defenses there were stronger, and the fog had lifted earlier, allowing the defenders to see and fire on the attackers. But the 3rd Army's southern flank was now exposed by the 5th Army's retreat. That night, Ludendorff studied the reports at his headquarters. The attack had exceeded all expectations. Hütter's 18th Army had smashed through the British lines. The way to Amiens and possibly Paris seemed open. But there were troubling signs that Ludendorff ignored or didn't fully understand. The stormtrooper units had suffered the heaviest casualties. These elite troops, the best Germany had, were being killed and wounded at alarming rates. They were leading every attack, taking on the most dangerous missions, absorbing the worst of the enemy fire. Germany couldn't afford to lose these men, they were irreplaceable. More troubling, the advance was creating its own problems. The German infantry had pushed forward 10 to 14 kilometers in a single day. That was unprecedented. But it meant they were now beyond the range of their own artillery, which couldn't move forward quickly through the shell-cratered no man's land. The advancing troops were running low on ammunition, food, and water. Supply columns were struggling to catch up across the devastated battlefield. And the British, though retreating, hadn't broken. Units were still fighting. Strongpoints were still holding. The British Fifth Army might be battered, but it wasn't destroyed. Ludendorff made a critical decision that night. He decided to reinforce success to pour more troops into Hütter's 18th Army sector, where the breakthrough was deepest. This was the correct tactical decision. But it meant stripping reserves from the other armies, particularly from the 17th Army in the north, which was supposed to be pushing toward the Channel ports. The offensive continued on March 22nd. German troops advanced another 10 kilometers in some sectors. They recaptured Albert, a town that had been in British hands since 1916. They were now threatening Amiens, the critical railway junction that supplied the entire southern half of the British front. If Amiens fell, the British expeditionary force would be cut in two. Supplies couldn't flow to the armies in the south. Haig would be forced to retreat toward the Channel ports, opening a gap between the British and French armies. It would be a disaster of the first order. The British response was desperate. Haig threw every available unit into the battle. Exhausted divisions that had been pulled back to rest were rushed forward again. New Zealand troops, Australian troops, cavalry divisions, anything that could hold a line. The Royal Flying Corps, the predecessor to the RAF, flew constant sorties, strafing German columns and bombing supply routes. On March 23, German troops reached the Crozet Canal, the last major natural obstacle before Amiens. Captain Eugen von Schaubert of the 3rd Bavarian Regiment led his company across a partially destroyed bridge in the early morning fog. They reached the far side before the British even knew they were there. Other German units followed, establishing bridgeheads across the canal. But the advance was slowing. German infantry were exhausted after 3 days of continuous fighting. They had marched and fought across 20 to 30 kilometers of devastated terrain. They hadn't slept. They had minimal food and water. Ammunition was running low. And they were discovering something that would doom the entire offensive. The British had destroyed everything during their retreat. The Germans were advancing through wasteland. The British had implemented a scorched earth policy. Every village was demolished. Every well was poisoned or filled in. Every road was cratered. Every bridge was blown. Railroad tracks were torn up. Food stores were burned. The advancing Germans found nothing: no shelter, no food, no water, no infrastructure. German soldiers, exhausted and starving, began looting captured British supply dumps. They found food, real food, not the meager rations they had been living on for years. Tinned meat, bread, chocolate, cigarettes, alcohol. Men who had been eating turnips and black bread for months gorged themselves. Entire units stopped advancing and started eating. One German soldier, Lieutenant Ernst Junger, who would later write famous memoirs about the war, recorded the scene in a captured British supply dump. There was food and drink in overwhelming abundance. We drank rum. We drank wine. We drank whiskey. We ate everything we could find. Men were laughing, singing, completely drunk. Officers had lost control. I tried to get my men moving again, but they just laughed at me. The advance had stopped not because of enemy resistance, but because we were looting like bandits. This was a catastrophic breakdown in discipline. But it was also a symptom of a deeper problem. German logistics couldn't keep up with the advance. The supply system that worked in defensive warfare where you held fixed positions and could stockpile supplies broke down completely when units were advancing 10 kilometers per day across shell-torn ground. Meanwhile, the Allies were beginning to coordinate their response. On March 26, a critical meeting took place at Doullens, a small town behind the British lines. Present were French President Raymond Poincaré, French Premier Georges Clemenceau, French General Philippe Pétain, British Field Marshal Douglas Haig, and French General Ferdinand Foch. The discussion was tense. Haig believed the Germans were trying to separate the British and French armies and drive the British to the Channel. Pétain believed the Germans were actually aiming for Paris and wanted to pull French troops back to defend the capital. If both commanders followed their instincts, a massive gap would open in the Allied lines, exactly what Ludendorff wanted. The solution was radical: appoint a supreme Allied commander with authority over both British and French forces. General Foch was chosen for the role. He was 66 years old, a veteran of every major French offensive, and an aggressive fighter who believed in attack above all else. His first order was simple: hold. Every man, every unit, every position. Conduct a fighting withdrawal if necessary, but maintain contact between the British and French armies. Do not let the Germans separate us. This decision, made in a small room in Doullens on March 26, 1918, may have saved the Allied cause. Unified command meant unified strategy. It meant reserves could be shifted where they were needed most. It meant the British and French would fight as one army, not two separate forces. By March 28, Operation Michael was running out of steam. Ludendorff made one more attempt to revive it, launching Operation Mars, an attack on the Third Army positions around Arras. The Germans threw 29 divisions at the Third Army's lines. It failed completely. The Third Army's defenses at Arras were much stronger than the Fifth Army's had been. There was no fog to mask the German advance. British artillery, now properly positioned and supplied, smashed the German assault formations. After 2 days of fighting, Operation Mars was called off. The Germans had gained almost nothing and suffered heavy casualties. Ludendorff then shifted his focus back south, ordering another push toward Amiens on April 4th. Again, the attack failed. British and Australian troops, supported by French reserves, held the line at Villers-Bretonneux, just 16 kilometers east of Amiens. The Germans could see the cathedral spires of Amiens. They could almost touch it, but they couldn't break through. On April 5th, 1918, Ludendorff officially ended Operation Michael. The results were stunning, by the standards of World War I. The Germans had captured 1,200 square miles of territory, more than the British had gained in 141 days during the 1916 Somme offensive. They had advanced up to 40 miles in 16 days. They had captured over 90,000 prisoners, 1,300 artillery pieces, 200 tanks, and vast quantities of supplies. But they had failed to achieve their objectives. They hadn't separated the British and French armies. They hadn't captured Amiens. They hadn't destroyed the British Fifth Army. It had retreated, but it remained intact and reorganized. They hadn't broken through to the Channel ports. And the cost had been staggering. German casualties for Operation Michael alone totaled approximately 240,000 men killed, wounded, and missing. The British and French had lost roughly 250,000. But here's the critical difference: the Allies could replace their losses. More British troops were arriving from across the Empire. More French troops were being mobilized. And American troops were arriving in France at a rate of 250,000 per month. Germany couldn't replace its losses. The stormtrooper units, the best soldiers Germany had been decimated. The 1,899 birth cohort, the youngest German soldiers, had suffered 60% casualties. The German army that emerged from Operation Michael was weaker than the army that began it. But Ludendorff wasn't done. He had 3 more offensives planned: Operation Georgette in Flanders, Operation Blücher on the Aisne, and Operation Gneisenau at Reims. Each would follow the same pattern: initial success, territorial gains, and ultimately failure to achieve strategic objectives. Let's briefly examine these subsequent operations to understand how the pattern repeated. Operation Georgette began on April 9, 1918, targeting the British lines in Flanders near the Lys River. The Germans used the same tactics: Bruchmüller's artillery preparation followed by stormtrooper assault. The initial attack hit the Portuguese 2nd Division, which was holding a sector of the British line. The Portuguese troops, poorly trained and equipped, collapsed almost immediately. Over 7,000 Portuguese soldiers were killed or captured in the first day. The Germans poured through the gap, advancing toward the critical railway junction at Hazebrouck. If they captured Hazebrouck, the entire British position in Flanders would become untenable. On April 11th, Haig issued his famous "backs to the wall" order. Every position must be held to the last man. There must be no retirement. With our backs to the wall and believing in the justice of our cause, each one of us must fight on to the end. British troops, reinforced by Australian and Canadian units, held. The fighting was desperate hand-to-hand combat in some sectors, but the line held. By April 29th, Operation Georgette had stalled. The Germans had gained some ground but again failed to achieve a breakthrough. German casualties, approximately 120,000. Allied casualties, approximately 120,000. Another draw, but Germany couldn't afford draws. Operation Blücherjoch began on May 27th, targeting French positions along the Chemin des Dames Ridge. The sector was partly held by 4 exhausted British divisions that had been sent there to rest after Operation Michael. The French commander, General Denis Duchesne, had ignored modern defensive doctrine and packed his troops into forward positions exactly where Bruchmüller's artillery would hit them hardest. The result was catastrophic for the Allies. The German attack broke through completely. French and British troops fled in panic. Within 3 days, German forces had advanced 50 kilometers, the deepest advance of the entire year. They reached the Marne River, the same river where the German advance had been stopped in 1914. Paris was only 90 kilometers away. But again, the Germans couldn't exploit the breakthrough. Supply lines were too long. The troops were exhausted. American units, fresh, well-fed, eager to fight, arrived to plug the gaps. The most famous of these was the Battle of Belleau Wood, where U.S. Marines fought for 3 weeks to clear German forces from a small forest. The Marines suffered 50% casualties but held. The German advance stopped. The final major offensive, Operation Gneisenau, was launched on June 9th near Reims. It failed almost immediately. French intelligence had captured the German plans. French artillery devastated the German assembly areas before the attack even began. The German troops advanced into a prepared killing ground. After 3 days, Gneisenau was called off. It had achieved nothing. By mid-July 1918, the Kaiser Schlacht was over. Ludendorff had launched 4 major offensives and several smaller ones. He had captured enormous amounts of territory. He had inflicted nearly 1 million Allied casualties. He had come within 90 kilometers of Paris. But he had lost. Strategically, completely, irreversibly lost. The German army that had begun the spring offensive with 5.1 million men now numbered 4.2 million. Nearly 1 million casualties in 4 months. More critically, the quality of the army had collapsed. The stormtrooper units were gone, dead, wounded, scattered. The elite soldiers who had led the attacks were irreplaceable. What remained was an army of old men, boys, and recovered wounded. Germany needed 200,000 replacement soldiers per month to maintain strength. It could provide 70,000 to 80,000 from recovering wounded. The 1919 conscription class could provide 300,000 more, but these were 18-year-old boys with minimal training. After that, there was nothing. Germany had scraped the barrel. Every man who could fight was already fighting. The Allies, by contrast, were growing stronger every day. British and French losses were being replaced. The Canadian and Australian divisions, which hadn't suffered as badly because they hadn't been at the point of the German attacks, were fresh and ready. And the Americans were arriving in overwhelming numbers. By July 1918, over 1 million American soldiers were in France. By September, over 2 million. On July 18, 1918, the French launched a counteroffensive at Soissons. It was supported by over 300 tanks and massive artillery preparation. The German lines, extended and thinned by the spring offensive gains, collapsed. The Germans were forced to retreat, giving up all the ground they had captured in Operation Blücher. On August 8, 1918, Ludendorff would later call it the Black Day of the German Army. British, Canadian, and Australian forces launched a massive attack at Amiens. Over 400 tanks, supported by aircraft and the most sophisticated artillery preparation yet seen, smashed through German lines. In a single day, the Allies advanced 12 kilometers and captured 16,000 prisoners. Entire German divisions surrendered without fighting. This began the 100 Days Offensive, a series of Allied attacks that would continue until the armistice on November 11, 1918. The German army retreated steadily, losing ground every day. The Hindenburg Line, the strongest defensive position Germany had built, was breached in late September. By October, German units were surrendering en masse. By November, the war was over. Why did the Kaiserschlacht fail? The easy answer is that Germany simply didn't have enough resources to win. That's true, but it's not the complete answer. The spring offensive failed for specific, identifiable reasons that are worth understanding. First, Ludendorff's strategy was fundamentally flawed. He didn't have a clear strategic objective. Operation Michael was supposed to separate the British and French armies, but when that didn't happen, Ludendorff kept pushing toward Amiens because that's where he was making progress. When Amiens didn't fall, he launched Operation Georgette because, why exactly? Because the British looked weak there. When that failed, he attacked the French at the Chemin des Dames because he thought he could break through. It was opportunistic, not strategic. He was winning battles but not the war. Second, the stormtrooper tactics that worked so brilliantly in the initial attack created their own problems. The elite stormtroopers pushed deep into enemy territory, leaving strongpoints and defensive positions for follow-on troops to clear. But the follow-on troops were slower, less skilled, less aggressive. They got bogged down fighting for positions that the stormtroopers had bypassed. Meanwhile, the stormtroopers themselves, racing ahead, outran their supplies and support. They ended up isolated, exhausted, and vulnerable. Third, logistics. The German supply system couldn't keep up with a rapid advance. German artillery had to move forward across shell-cratered battlefields. Supply wagons had to navigate roads that didn't exist anymore. Food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, everything had to be carried forward manually. The British had destroyed all the infrastructure during their retreat. The Germans found themselves advancing into a desert, with no food, no water, no shelter. Men starved. Horses died. Ammunition ran out. Fourth, casualties. Germany lost its best soldiers in the spring offensive. The stormtroopers, the elite troops who had received extra training and equipment, suffered the highest casualty rates. They led every attack, took on the most dangerous missions, and died in disproportionate numbers. By the end of the spring offensive, these irreplaceable soldiers were gone. The German army that fought in the 100 Days Offensive was a shadow of the force that had attacked on March 21st. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, America. Ludendorff had gambled that he could break the Allied armies before American troops arrived in force. He lost that gamble. By the time the spring offensive ended, over 1 million American soldiers were in France, with more arriving every day. These troops were fresh, well-fed, well-equipped, and eager to fight. They had minimal combat experience, but they had overwhelming numbers and an endless supply chain stretching back to the most powerful industrial nation on Earth. Germany, by contrast, was starving. The British naval blockade had been in effect since 1914. German civilians were subsisting on turnips and black bread. There was no coffee, no sugar, no meat. The 1918 harvest would be the worst of the war. Morale on the home front was collapsing. German soldiers on leave returned to find their families starving. When they returned to the front, they knew they were fighting a losing battle. The Kaiserschlacht was Germany's last throw of the dice. And when it failed, Germany had nothing left. But what about the individuals, the soldiers who fought in those desperate battles? What happened to them? Lieutenant Ernst Jünger, the stormtrooper officer who wrote about looting the British supply dumps, survived the war. He went on to write Storm of Steel, one of the most famous memoirs of World War I. He described the stormtroopers as a race of warriors inspired by the desire for battle and wild exhilaration. But he also described the horror, the exhaustion, the senseless waste of young lives. Colonel George Bruchmüller, the artillery genius who developed the Führerwalls, retired after the war with the rank of colonel. The new German army, the Reichswehr, didn't want him. He was too old, too tied to the old system. He wrote several books about artillery tactics, which were studied by militaries around the world. He died in 1948 at age 84, having lived to see a Second World War where his tactics were used on an even larger scale. General Erich Ludendorff never accepted responsibility for Germany's defeat. He promoted the stab in the back myth, the lie that Germany had been betrayed by politicians, socialists, and Jews, not defeated on the battlefield. This lie would poison German politics for decades and contribute to the rise of the Nazis. Ludendorff himself participated in Hitler's beer hall putsch in 1923. He died in 1937, just in time to avoid seeing his country destroyed in an even more catastrophic war. General Oskar von Hüdier, whose tactics defined the Spring Offensive, retired after the war. He died in 1934, aged 73, in Potsdam. And what of the ordinary soldiers, the stormtroopers who led the attacks, the British infantrymen who defended against them? Private Thomas Bracy of the Royal Munster Fusiliers, who we met at the beginning of this story, died on March 21, 1918, during the initial bombardment. He was 22 years old. His body was never found. He's commemorated on the Pozieres Memorial in France, one of over 14,000 British soldiers who died in the Spring Offensive and have no known grave. Gefreiter Hans Schmidt, a German stormtrooper in the 1st Guards Reserve Division, survived March 21. His unit captured 3,000 British prisoners that day. He wrote in his diary, "We thought we had won. We thought the war was over. We didn't understand that we had just killed ourselves." Schmidt was killed on August 27, 1918, during the Allied counteroffensive. He was 20 years old. Sergeant Albert Jenkins of the Australian 4th Division was part of the force that stopped the German advance at Villers-Bretonneux in April. He wrote to his mother, "The Germans fought like lions. They came at us again and again. But we held. We held because we knew if we didn't, the war was lost." Jenkins survived the war, returned to Australia, and died in 1967 at age 71. Captain Eugen von Schaubert, who led his company across the Crozet Canal, survived the Spring Offensive. He would go on to have a long military career. In World War II, he was a general commanding the 11th Army in the Soviet Union. He died in 1941 when his plane accidentally landed in a Soviet minefield. A fitting end, perhaps, for a man who had spent his life on battlefields. The Spring Offensive of 1918 killed approximately 850,000 men, German, British, French, American, in less than 4 months. To put that in perspective, it's roughly equivalent to the entire population of San Francisco being wiped out. Villages in Britain, France, and Germany lost entire generations of young men. Some communities never recovered. In the German village of Adenau in the Eifel region, 96 men died in World War I. The village had a population of 1,800. That's 5% of the entire population dead. Every family lost someone. In some families, all the sons died. The village church has a memorial listing all the names. Looking at that memorial today, you see the same last names repeated again and again. Müller, Schmidt, Fischer. 3 Müllers. 4 Schmidts. 2 Fischers. Brothers, cousins, neighbors. This was the human cost of the Kaiserschlacht. Not just statistics, but individuals. Men with names, families, dreams. Men who died in the mud of Picardy believing they were fighting for something important. Men who never got to see their children grow up, never returned to their farms and factories, never lived the lives they should have lived. The military cemeteries in northern France tell the story more clearly than any history book. At the Pozieres Memorial, there are 14,657 names of British and Commonwealth soldiers who died in the Spring Offensive and have no known grave. Just names on stone. At the German cemetery at Freicourt, there are 17,027 graves, many marked simply, Ein Deutscher Soldat, dash, a German soldier, unknown, unidentified, forgotten. Walk through these cemeteries today, and you notice something haunting: the dates. March 21st, 1918. March 22nd, 1918. March 23rd, 1918. Row after row of headstones, all with the same dates. Whole companies wiped out in single days. Battalions that ceased to exist between dawn and dusk. There's a particular grave at the Thiepval Memorial that captures the tragedy perfectly. It's for Private William McFadzean of the 36th Ulster Division. He was 20 years old when he died on March 21st, 1918. His headstone has an inscription chosen by his parents. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. But here's the thing. William McFadzean had already won the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor, in 1916 at the Somme. He had thrown himself on a German grenade to save his comrades. He survived that. He recovered from his wounds. He returned to the front. And on March 21st, 1918, he was killed in the opening bombardment of the Spring Offensive. A hero who survived his own heroic sacrifice only to die in an anonymous barrage 2 years later. That's what the Spring Offensive was, an anonymous slaughter on a scale that makes individual heroism seem futile. But we should talk about the technological legacy of the Kaiserschlacht, because it changed warfare forever. The stormtrooper tactics developed by Willy Rohr and perfected by Oskar von Hütter became the foundation of modern infantry tactics. Every army in World War II used variations of infiltration tactics. Small units, heavily armed, moving independently, bypassing strongpoints. This is how infantry still operates today. The Germans called it Bewegungskrieg, war of movement. The British called it fire and maneuver. The Americans called it combined arms assault. But it all traces back to the stormtroopers of 1918. The MP-18 submachine gun, carried by German stormtroopers, was the first practical submachine gun ever deployed in combat. It fired 9mm pistol rounds at 500 rounds per minute. It was revolutionary. Before the MP-18, soldiers carried bolt-action rifles that fired one shot every few seconds. The MP-18 could fire 8 rounds per second. In close-quarters trench fighting, it was devastatingly effective. Every modern submachine gun, the Thompson, the Sten, the MP-40, the Uzi, is a descendant of the MP-18. George Bruchmüller's artillery tactics became the standard for every army in World War II. The short, intense bombardment focused on specific targets. The mixture of gas and high explosive. The creeping barrage moving ahead of the infantry. The counter-battery fire to neutralize enemy artillery. These techniques were used by every major combatant in the next war: the Germans in Poland and France, the Soviets at Stalingrad, the Americans in Normandy. Modern artillery doctrine still uses Bruchmüller's principles. But there's a darker legacy too. The Spring Offensive proved that even the most sophisticated tactics couldn't overcome strategic reality. Germany's fundamental problem wasn't tactical, it was that they were fighting too many enemies with too few resources. No amount of tactical brilliance could change that. This is a lesson that Germany failed to learn. In 1939, Adolf Hitler would launch another war believing that tactical superiority, blitzkrieg, the evolved form of stormtrooper tactics, could overcome strategic inferiority. And for a while, it worked. Poland fell in 5 weeks. France fell in 6 weeks. The early German advances in the Soviet Union were even faster than the spring offensive of 1918. But ultimately, the same factors that defeated Germany in 1918 defeated them in 1945. They were fighting too many enemies, they couldn't replace their losses, and they ran out of resources. The tactical brilliance of the Wehrmacht in 1940-41 was just as futile as the tactical brilliance of the Sturmtruppen in 1918. Both times, Germany won battles but lost the war. There's a military principle called the culminating point of victory, the moment when an offensive force has advanced so far and suffered so many casualties that it can no longer continue attacking. Every offensive reaches this point eventually. The spring offensive reached it in early April 1918, less than 3 weeks after it began. The Germans had captured 1,200 square miles of territory. They had inflicted enormous casualties on the Allies. But they had exhausted themselves in the process. The tragedy is that Ludendorff didn't recognize this. Instead of consolidating his gains and shifting to the defensive, he launched 3 more major offensives. Each one followed the same pattern: initial success, territorial gains, then culmination and stalemate. Each one cost Germany more irreplaceable soldiers. Each one weakened the German army without bringing victory any closer. By August 1918, when the Allies launched their counteroffensive, the German army was a shell. The stormtroopers were gone. The artillery ammunition was running low. The horses that pulled the supply wagons were dying of starvation. There was no fodder. The soldiers were exhausted, demoralized, and increasingly convinced they were fighting a lost cause. German soldier Ernst Toller, who fought in the spring offensive and later became a famous playwright, wrote, "We had won 12 battles and lost the war. We had advanced 40 miles and gained nothing but graves. We had killed the enemy and killed ourselves. And for what? So that the old men in their headquarters could move pins on their maps? So that the generals could claim victories in their memoirs? We died for nothing. And we knew it. That was the worst part. We knew it was all futile. But we kept fighting anyway because no one would give the order to stop." The psychological impact on the survivors was profound. German soldiers who lived through the spring offensive returned home to a country that didn't want to hear about their experiences. The veterans felt betrayed. They had been told they were winning, that one more push would end the war, that victory was within reach. Instead, Germany surrendered. The soldiers who had fought so hard, who had sacrificed so much, came home to a country in political chaos, economic collapse, and social revolution. Many veterans joined the Freikorps paramilitary organizations that fought against communists in post-war Germany. These men, brutalized by 4 years of war, brought their violence home. They fought in the streets of Berlin and Munich. They assassinated politicians. They attempted coups. The Weimar Republic's early years were marked by this political violence, and much of it came from disillusioned veterans of the Spring Offensive. Some of these veterans would later join the Nazi Party. The Stormtroopers of 1918 became the inspiration for the Sturmabteilung, the SA, the Nazi brown shirts. The name was deliberate. Hitler wanted to evoke the elite assault troops of the Great War. The tactics were similar too: small groups, sudden violence, overwhelming the enemy before they could respond. Except instead of British trenches, the targets were political opponents in German cities. This is part of why the Kaiserschlacht matters. It's not just a military campaign that failed. It's a turning point in German history. The failure of the Spring Offensive led directly to Germany's surrender in November 1918. The surrender led to the Treaty of Versailles, which many Germans saw as a humiliation. The sense of betrayal and humiliation created the conditions for the rise of extremism. And that extremism led to an even more catastrophic war 20 years later. Could the Spring Offensive have succeeded? Historians love to debate this question. What if Ludendorff had concentrated all his forces on a single objective instead of launching multiple offensives? What if the fog hadn't been so thick on March 21st, allowing the British to see and respond to the attack? What if American troops had arrived 6 months earlier? These are interesting questions, But they missed the fundamental point. Germany couldn't win World War I in 1918. The strategic situation was hopeless. Even if Operation Michael had succeeded, even if the Germans had captured Amiens, separated the British and French armies, and destroyed the BF, they still couldn't have won the war. Why? Because America was in the war. By July 1918, American troops were arriving at a rate of 250,000 per month. By the end of 1918, there would have been over 3 million American soldiers in France. Germany had no counter to this. They couldn't match those numbers. They couldn't match American industrial production. They couldn't match American resources. The spring offensive was Germany's last chance to win before the Americans arrived in overwhelming force. It failed. After that, defeat was inevitable. The only question was how long it would take and how many more men would die. In that sense, every German soldier who died after April 1918 died for nothing. The war was already lost. The 100 Days Offensive was just a formal process of acknowledging that reality. This is the ultimate tragedy of the Kaiser Schlacht. Hundreds of thousands of men, German, British, French, American, died in the spring and summer of 1918 fighting for a war that was already decided. The Germans were fighting for a victory they couldn't achieve. The Allies were fighting to hasten a victory that was already inevitable. And in the middle of all this futility were the stormtroopers, the elite soldiers who had trained for years, who had developed revolutionary tactics, who had broken through defenses that everyone said were impregnable. These men did everything that was asked of them. They achieved tactical victories that should have been impossible. They advanced farther and faster than anyone thought possible. And it didn't matter. They won battles and lost the war. They became historical footnotes. Their tactics were copied by every army in the world, but their names were forgotten. The stormtroopers of 1918 are remembered today only as a collective, as a tactical innovation, a military unit, a historical phenomenon. But as individuals, most of them are lost to history. There's something deeply tragic about that. These were extraordinary soldiers. They were brave, skilled, dedicated. They deserved better than to die in a futile offensive, fighting for objectives that would be abandoned within months, serving generals who didn't understand that the war was already lost. If you visit the Western Front today, you can still see traces of the spring offensive. In the fields around Street Quinton and Albert, farmers occasionally plow up rusted helmets, shell fragments, bones. The landscape has healed, the shell craters have been filled in, the trenches have collapsed, the barbed wire has rusted away. But if you know where to look, you can still see the scars. There are still unexploded shells in those fields. Every year, French and Belgian bomb disposal teams clear hundreds of them. Some are German shells from the March 21st bombardment. Some are British shells fired in response. All of them are still dangerous after more than a century in the ground. The local farmers call them the iron harvest, the deadly crop that the war left behind. There are also memorials. Lots of them. The Thiepval Memorial to the Missing. The Pozières Memorial. The German Cemetery at Freicourt. The Australian Memorial at Villers-Bretonneux. Each one commemorates the men who died in the spring offensive. Each one has thousands of names carved in stone. But here's what strikes me about these memorials. They're all national. The British Memorial commemorates British soldiers. The German Cemetery holds German soldiers. The Australian Memorial honors Australians. There's no shared memorial, no acknowledgement that all these men were victims of the same feudal war. And maybe that's appropriate. Because the spring offensive wasn't a shared tragedy, it was a conflict. The Germans were trying to win. The British were trying to survive. They weren't victims of fate or bad luck. They were enemies, trying to kill each other. The fact that they were all pawns in a larger game doesn't change that. But it does make you think. What if Ludendorff had accepted in November 1917 that Germany couldn't win? What if he had negotiated a peace instead of launching a desperate offensive? The terms wouldn't have been favorable. Germany would have had to give up Belgium, probably Alsace-Lorraine, maybe some territory in the east. But those were the same territories they lost anyway when they surrendered in November 1918. How many lives would have been saved? The spring offensive killed 850,000 men. The 100 Days Offensive killed another 500,000. That's 1.35 million men who died between March and November 1918, fighting for a war that was already decided. 1.35 million fathers, sons, brothers, husbands who never came home. Was it worth it? What did Germany gain from those 8 months of fighting? Nothing. They lost the war anyway. They lost more territory than they would have in a negotiated peace. Their economy was destroyed. Their society was traumatized. Their political system collapsed. And they lost an entire generation of young men. This is the legacy of the Kaiserschlacht, a brilliant tactical achievement that was also a strategic catastrophe. A demonstration of military skill that was also a monument to futility. A battle that will be studied in military academies for centuries as an example of how to break through entrenched defenses and also as an example of how tactical victories mean nothing without strategic sense. The stormtroopers of 1918 deserved better. They deserved to serve a country with realistic war aims. They deserved generals who understood that war is politics by other means, not an end in itself. They deserved a leadership that would recognize when the war was lost and negotiate peace rather than sacrificing hundreds of thousands of lives in a futile attempt to postpone the inevitable. Instead, they got Ludendorff, a brilliant tactician but a terrible strategist, a man who could win battles but didn't understand how to win wars, who would rather sacrifice his entire army than admit defeat. And so the stormtroopers attacked. They broke through the British lines. They advanced 40 miles in 3 weeks. They captured 90,000 prisoners. They inflicted enormous casualties on the enemy. They did everything that was asked of them. And then they died. In the counter-offensives of summer and fall 1918, the survivors were thrown into desperate defensive battles against the Allied advance. The elite stormtrooper units that had led the spring offensive were used as emergency reserves, rushed from crisis to crisis, plugging gaps in the collapsing German line. By November 1918, most of them were dead. The few who survived came home to a Germany they barely recognized. The Kaiser had abdicated. The monarchy was gone. The country was in revolution. The economy had collapsed. Food was scarce. The Spanish flu was killing thousands. And everyone was blaming everyone else for the defeat. The politicians blamed the generals blamed the politicians, the right blamed the left, and everyone blamed the Jews. Into this chaos came the myth of the stab in the back, the lie that Germany hadn't really been defeated on the battlefield, but had been betrayed by civilians at home. Ludendorff himself promoted this myth. It was easier to believe than the truth, that he had launched a brilliant but futile offensive that achieved nothing except killing hundreds of thousands of men. The stormtroopers who survived found themselves pawns in this political game. They had fought bravely. They had done their duty. They had been told they were winning. And now they were being told the defeat was someone else's fault. The socialists, the Jews, the politicians who stabbed Germany in the back. Some believed it. Some joined the Freikorps and fought in the streets. Some joined the Nazi Party and helped bring Hitler to power. Some became the perpetrators of an even greater crime, the Holocaust, believing they were avenging the betrayal of 1918. Others rejected it. They knew the truth. They had been there. They had seen the exhaustion, the starvation, the collapse of morale. They knew the war was lost by August 1918, if not earlier. But these men, the ones who told the truth, were often dismissed as defeatists or traitors. Germany didn't want to hear that the spring offensive had failed because Germany wasn't strong enough to win. It was easier to believe in betrayal than to accept defeat. This brings us to the final question: what can we learn from the Kaiserschlacht? The military lessons are clear. The stormtrooper tactics revolutionized warfare. The infiltration methods, the emphasis on small unit initiative, the combined use of different weapons, all of this became standard in every army. Modern special forces still use variants of these tactics. The U.S. Army's Ranger School teaches infiltration techniques that would be instantly recognizable to a 1918 stormtrooper. But there are broader lessons too. Lessons about strategy, about war aims, about knowing when to fight and when to negotiate. The first lesson, tactics without strategy is futile. Ludendorff was a tactical genius. The spring offensive was brilliantly conceived and executed at the tactical level. But it had no clear strategic objective. Ludendorff was winning battles without a plan for winning the war. He was reacting to success rather than creating it. When one offensive stalled, he launched another. When that stalled, he launched another. He was like a gambler at a casino, doubling down after every loss, convinced that the next bet would be the winner. The second lesson, you can't win a war of attrition if you're outnumbered. Germany in 1918 was facing the combined might of Britain, France, and their empires, plus the United States. Even if the spring offensive had succeeded beyond Ludendorff's wildest dreams, even if they had captured Amiens, destroyed the BF, and knocked Britain out of the war, they still would have faced France and America. And they couldn't beat both. The third lesson, elite units are valuable but irreplaceable. The stormtroopers were Germany's best soldiers. Using them as assault troops was tactically effective but strategically disastrous. When they died, and they died in disproportionate numbers, they couldn't be replaced. The German army that fought in the 100 Days Offensive was quantitatively similar to the army that began the Spring Offensive, but qualitatively inferior. The best soldiers were gone. The fourth lesson, logistics matter more than tactics. The German advance outran its supplies. The stormtroopers found themselves advancing into a wasteland, with no food, no water, no ammunition. No amount of tactical skill can overcome empty stomachs and empty ammunition pouches. The Allies understood this. They retreated slowly, destroying infrastructure as they went, knowing that German logistics couldn't keep up with a rapid advance. The fifth lesson, morale is fragile. The German soldiers began the spring offensive believing they could win the war. When the offensive stalled, that belief shattered. Once soldiers start thinking the war is lost, it's almost impossible to restore morale. The German army fought for 7 more months after the spring offensive ended, but they were going through the motions. They knew they had lost. They were just waiting for the end. These lessons were ignored by Germany in 1939. Hitler launched World War II with similar assumptions. That tactical superiority could overcome strategic inferiority, that quick victories would demoralize the enemy, that willpower could triumph over material reality. And for a while, it worked. But ultimately, the same factors that defeated Germany in 1918 defeated them in 1945. The Kaiserschlacht is a case study in how not to fight a war. It's a demonstration that brilliance at the tactical level means nothing if your strategy is flawed. It's a reminder that wars are won by logistics, production, and resources more than by courage and skill. And it's a tragedy, a monument to the hundreds of thousands of men who died fighting for a lost cause, serving generals who should have known better. If you remember nothing else from this story, remember this: the German Stormtroopers of 1918 were extraordinary soldiers who did extraordinary things. They broke through defenses that everyone said were impregnable. They advanced farther and faster than anyone thought possible. They inflicted enormous casualties on the enemy. They demonstrated that even the Western Front stalemate could be broken with the right tactics and enough determination. And none of it mattered. They won battles and lost the war. They became footnotes in history books. Their tactics were copied by every army in the world, but their names were forgotten. They died for a cause that was already lost, serving a nation that would collapse within months of their greatest victory. That's the tragedy of the Kaiserschlacht. Not that it failed, it was always going to fail, given the strategic realities. But that so many brave men died believing they were winning, believing their sacrifices mattered, believing that one more push, one more attack, one more battle would end the war. They were wrong. The war ended 8 months later with Germany's surrender. All those battles, all those casualties, all those sacrifices, they bought Germany nothing except a slightly longer war and a slightly worse peace. The stormtroopers who died on March 21, 1918, in the opening hours of Operation Michael, never knew this. They died believing they were part of something important. That their attack would break the British lines, that the war would be over by summer, that they would go home as victors. The stormtroopers who survived to August 1918, who fought in the desperate defensive battles of the 100 Days Offensive, knew better. They knew the war was lost. They knew they were just delaying the inevitable. They fought anyway, because that's what soldiers do. But they knew. And that knowledge, the certainty that all their efforts were futile, that all their comrades had died for nothing, must have been unbearable. When we study the Kaiserschlacht today, we should remember both groups. The men who died believing in victory, and the men who survived knowing they had lost. Both groups deserve to be remembered. Both groups paid the price for Ludendorff's desperate gamble. The spring offensive of 1918 was the Kaiser's last battle. It was also the last time a purely tactical innovation could shape the course of a major war. After 1918, wars would be won by industry, by logistics, by the ability to mobilize entire societies for total war. Tactical skill would still matter, it always matters, but it would never again be decisive by itself. The stormtroopers proved this. They were the best tactical soldiers of their generation, perhaps of any generation. And they lost anyway. Because tactics can win battles, but only strategy can win wars. And Germany's strategy in 1918 was to roll the dice and hope for a miracle. They didn't get their miracle. They got the Kaiserschlacht, a brilliant, futile, tragic offensive that killed nearly 1 million men and achieved nothing. A perfect symbol for the entire war. Brave men dying in vast numbers for reasons that made no sense, serving causes that weren't worth the sacrifice, fighting battles that changed nothing. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns finally fell silent. The war was over. Germany had lost. The stormtroopers who survived began the long journey home to a country that would spend the next century trying to understand why so many men had died for nothing. The answer is simple and terrible. They died because their leaders couldn't admit defeat. Because Ludendorff would rather sacrifice 1 million men than negotiate peace. Because the German high command believed that willpower could overcome reality. Because no one had the courage to say the war was lost and stop the killing. That's the real lesson of the Kaiserschlacht. Not the tactics, not the battles, not the advances and retreats. But the fundamental truth that wars should be fought for achievable objectives with realistic strategies. And when they can't be won, they should be ended, not prolonged through futile offensives that kill hundreds of thousands of men for nothing. The German stormtroopers of 1918 deserved better. They deserved leaders who understood this truth. Instead, they got the Kaiserschlacht. And they paid for it with their lives.